It's 7 o'clock, 9 p.m. here in Kyiv, and this is a Sky News special marking a year of conflict in Ukraine. A country counting the cost of Russia's illegal invasion after Putin's attempted blitzkrieg and hope of a swift victory were thwarted. Diplomatic maneuvers in New York will see the testy exchange between Ukraine and Russia at today's UN Security Council meeting. And we'll look at what's next in the war as the first Western tanks are delivered by Poland to Ukraine. Our correspondents will be live for us here in Russia, in New York and Berlin. Thousands of civilians killed, tens of thousands of soldiers, and millions still displaced. The war in Ukraine, 1 year on.
The shelter is very close.
The wreckage of Russian vehicles is littering this street.
It's World War III.
Here we go.
It started before dawn.
Can you hear that, Mark?
It's the only way out of Irpin, and this would test even the fit and healthy. But those still fleeing are the most vulnerable, the elderly, the frail and the very young.
There's no water, no electricity. They're still hanging on. I don't know how they're doing it, but they are.
They are going west to safety. He will now head east to fight.
There is going to be one almighty crush as people try to get on.
Rats going up behind you now.
Whatever fell from the sky made a crater this big.
Alex Crawford from Sky News.
Close the sky and stop bombing. Don't speak about the bureaucratic steps.
It's a professional ambush.
Now.
The bullets just don't miss.
Whoa! Whoa! Journalist!
The five of us have made it out of the car, down the embankment, and we just can't believe we're alive.
Good evening from the Ukrainian capital, Kyiv.
You can see what's left of the missile here. The words on the side of that, Zadeti, it means for children.
The train station was packed with people trying to find a way out.
This is what it's like in Kharkiv every day now.
A mass grave here triggered global horror.
These boys are out every day protecting their village, or what's left of it, with their own checkpoint and toy guns.
At first, we were scared, really scared. But now we are ready to fight. Fight like hell.
So through here, they're making the Molotov cocktails.
Vladimir Putin thought that Russian forces would capture Kyiv within days. They failed. Instead, his forces are bogged down in a war that they're unwilling to leave and so far incapable of winning.
This is absolutely incredible. We're on the outskirts of Kherson now. We're being given a military escort. And as you can see, people are absolutely euphoric.
Finally, Leopard 2 tanks are coming from Europe. You must be relieved.
Ще ні. Щойно. Шольц? Тільки що? У мене з Шольцем буде розмова. Ось зараз прес-секретар сказав, що щойно Шольц, канцлер Шольц, підтвердив, що дасть.
In war, it is always the children. Always the children displaced. Always the children without a say in what adults are doing to their world.
Good evening then from Kyiv. For a year now, war has raged in Europe, a thought unimaginable to many, even days before the invasion. The consequences have been felt around the world and pushed the West to unite in a way they failed to after Putin's invasion of Crimea. But as this conflict moves into a war of attrition, some fear this may not be the last anniversary we see. Today, though, President Zelensky told his people they had shown themselves to be invincible. Tonight, we'll report from here in Kyiv, where I'm joined by our Defence and Security Editor, Deborah Haynes. Our correspondent, Alex Rossi, is on the front line in eastern Ukraine, looking at the toll this war is taking. We'll get the view from Russia's home front a year into the war with our correspondent, Diana Magne, in eastern Siberia. And in the United States, Mark Stone will give us an update on the global diplomatic wranglings to keep her support for Ukraine shored up. But first this evening, Deborah Haynes looks now at the war in Ukraine, 1 year on.
Commemoration, not celebration. Ukraine marks 1 year of war by honouring those who died to keep this country free. The president Russia wanted to topple, still in charge.
Я хочу сказати усім вам, хто б'ється за Україну і хто живе Україною. Я хочу сказати, я пишаюся вами.
A nation hurting, but defiant. In the town of Bucha, where a mass grave was found, the pain runs deep. Russia's brief occupation here has left permanent scars.
Вона має закінчитися, бо хлопці, що вони чого лягли? Лягли, щоб війна закінчилась, щоб був мир.
This memorial wall in Kyiv is a reminder that Ukraine has actually been under attack since 2014. That's when Russia first invaded and annexed Crimea.
It became a frozen conflict, at times all but forgotten by many in the West. Vladimir Putin changed all that last year, galvanizing allies in a way that hasn't been seen since the Cold War. But Russia isn't backing down, and neither is Ukraine.
Despite the security risk, the president gave a live press conference in a sign of growing confidence.
Do you believe that Ukraine can achieve victory on the battlefield? Or do you believe that ultimately you're going to have to negotiate, maybe even compromise, maybe even talk to Vladimir Putin?
Після того, як всі побачили, як вони вбивають, катують, все це відбувається, незважаючи на те, що всі бачать, вони навіть не скривають атаки, чому ні, а все одно. І тоді після цього, після такої картини світу, як ви вважаєте, ми, українці, можемо сісти зараз за стіл перемовин ось з цим всім?
He hopes for victory this year. Until then, the war will go on. Each flag here in the capital is planted in memory of the fallen, a growing garden of grief and sacrifice.
And Deborah is here with me now. And that news conference by President Zelensky was very interesting, and it went on a long time, several hours. What did you make of his tone?
His tone was confident. It was of a leader. He's defied the odds. He's still in power. And it's such a contrast to the first big press conference that he gave back in April. Do you remember? It was in the underground in Kyiv. And we were all waiting again, similar huge numbers of journalists, him fielding for hours, question after question. But at that time, there's still security today, but there was massive security around that event. Nothing was broadcast live. And yet this one was live. It was the president in his capital, still in power, a year on from the invasion that Vladimir Putin launched and thought would topple him from that post within a few days. So defiant, strong, very much aware that he's still got a fight on his hand. absolutely unwavering when it comes to the idea of compromise and saying that they are going to win and hoping victory comes this year.
OK, Deborah, thanks very much. We'll talk to you again a little later in the programme. And Vladimir Putin's plans for a swift victory and a blitzkrieg rush on Kyiv were soon thwarted, of course, by Ukraine. Resistance slowed Russia's progress, and days turned into weeks and then months and now a year. Professor Michael Clark has this analysis of the course of the conflict.
If we think about the war on the 24th of March, after about a month, it was clear that the Russians were in several areas around Kiev, in the northeast, in the Donbass, and in this land bridge to the south. There were 4 big fronts. And although we could see that the Russians were making hard work of it, we thought that they will learn, they'll get better at it. They made no more hard work of it than in the great convoy that was approaching Kiev from the west. We now know it wasn't a convoy, it was a monumental traffic jam. 10 different battalion tactical groups all sought the same road to get away from the soft ground without proper planning, proper communication. And in the end, 1,000 tanks, 2,400 armoured vehicles, 10,000 troops were involved in a 35-mile traffic jam that spent a month before it could unwind itself. That was monumental. But that's where the war seemed to be after a month. We thought they'll get it right. They'll move in on these areas and try probably to move into the area east of the Dnieper River and take the whole of this eastern part of the country. But that's where we are today. Just look at the difference. The red areas indicate where the Russians occupy. The yellow areas are the 2 fairly big areas that the Ukrainians have liberated. So Kharkiv Oblast, Kharkiv region, they've got right through to the border of Luhansk. And in the west, they've taken back a lot of the Kherson Oblast right through to taking the city of Kherson itself, making the Russians abandon the city. And so here are the Russians occupying the Donbass, which they now say is their prime target, and holding on to this land bridge, very important to them, to maintain control of Crimea. But both sides are now preparing their offensives. As the winter plays itself out, we are expecting a lot more manoeuvre on this map, and we'll see in the months to come, as the winter fades away, who has the momentum in the next phase of this war, which certainly will run through for, I guess, the better part of this year at least.
Michael Clark there. Well, after the full-scale invasion, President Zelensky rejected a US offer to evacuate the country. "I need ammo, not a ride," he famously said. He then turned to Ukrainians, calling on them to take up arms and defend their homeland. A year into the war, and Western estimates put Ukraine's war dead at around 100,000. Now military cemeteries are constantly excavating fresh plots to accommodate those killed in battle. Our correspondent, Alex Rossi, is in the east of the country for us, looking at the sacrifices being made on the front line.
In a windswept graveyard, Victoria mourns her husband. "You are my life, you're my heart, my air. I love you," she says. Ruslan was killed a few days ago when he was hit by a tank round. His 3-year-old twins still don't understand their father is never coming home.
Ми просто сказала, що папа зірочкою став. Папа дивиться на вас з неба зірочкою. Коли вона каже, мам, дай телефон, позвоним папою, а в тебе серце обливається кров'ю, бо ти не знаєш, що сказати. Не знаєш, як пояснити дитині. Я кажу, папа зайнятий. Папа не може зараз відповісти на наш телефон.
Ukraine does not disclose figures for its dead, but it is a number that's rising fast. And so too is the rate of casualties. At this rehabilitation centre, soldiers try to overcome their injuries. Oleg was lacerated by shrapnel, and doctors have warned him he may still lose his limb. But despite his sacrifice, he says Russian aggression has only made this nation stronger.
Довгі часи Росія питалася нам, як ви знаєте, затмити, сховати нашу історію. То і завдяки цьому ми стали більш ріднішими і більш цінуємо життя, і більш цінуємо своїх рідних і переживаємо. І після цієї війни, після закінчення, буде новий розквіт України. Це однозначно.
What Vladimir Putin thought would be a lightning conquest has morphed into an exhausting duel of artillery, with no end in sight.
The fighting here in the Donbass over the last year has been absolutely relentless, and it appears to be getting worse in the face of a new Russian offensive. Now, in places like this, most people have left, and it's easy to understand why. Every day now, the artillery is getting closer.
In the shattered, broken communities of this region, people are weary, shuffling through the cold to fetch aid parcels as the fighting rages around them.
Я ночью не сплю, днем не сплю, вялый. Ну, не жизнь, а пекло, мука. Я чувствительный, у меня инвалидность, правда, 2-я группа. Хочу уехать, а жена не хочет.
But after a long year, the cost of this punishing war is increasingly only measured in pain and suffering. And at the cemetery, new plots are being excavated for soldiers that have not yet been killed in combat. It is a bleak picture, and this, of course, is just one military cemetery in a country which is bleeding for its survival. Alex Rossi, Sky News, in the Donbass.
Well, in Russia, the cost of the war is also clear. A mountainous Russian republic in eastern Siberia is among the regions which have suffered the most casualties among soldiers sent to fight. Our Moscow correspondent, Diana Magne, travelled to Buryatia in Siberia and has the latest on Russia's home front.
Buryatia feels like it's a world away from war in Europe. It is a different Russia, more like Mongolia next door than Moscow. But drive a little way from the main city of Ulan-Ude and you reach this graveyard, where the true cost of the war is spelt out in funeral garlands and military flags, and in the faces of men, all killed 6 time zones away in Ukraine. Vladislav Kokorin, he was 20 years old and he died on the second day of the war, on the 25th of February. Russia's been so reluctant to talk about their casualties, and you don't see these kinds of scenes on Russian state TV. But there have been so many killed already in this 1 year of fighting, and it doesn't look like it's going to end anytime soon. Though the numbers are hard to verify, Buryatia has one of the highest casualty counts of any Russian region. Polina, not her real name, has 2 nephews fighting in Ukraine. Both tried to terminate their contracts, she says, and they were turned down.
Его командир угрожал ему расстрелом, то есть он буквально держал пистолет у него на голове. У головы он сказал, что я тебя застрелю. Племянник сказал, хорошо, делай так. Я лучше умру сейчас, чем я пойду туда, и из меня сделают инвалида, или я убью сам кого-то.
Do you feel that Buryatians have been unfairly targeted to fight in this war?
Ну, да, я чувствую это, потому что мужчин, которых забрали из Бурятии, в разы больше, чем в других регионах. Моя подруга живет в Подмосковье, и в ее окружении нет ни одного мобилизованного. Это о чем-то говорит.
Living standards are low here, unemployment is high, an army contract is big money, and nearly everyone has lost someone.
У меня родственник приехал, он поехал добровольцем, получается, и он поехал за компанию вообще с друзьями. Он никогда не интересовался политикой, он живет в деревне, получается, там предложили хороший заработок. Когда он приехал, мы ожидали, он пьющий, мы ожидали, что он будет пить, но он приехал, и он не пил неделю, он неделю плакал. И он говорил, что от его друзей ничего не осталось, просто в пыль.
Yelena used to attend the rallies she could against war, then mobilization, till they were shut down. 20,000 people detained in this 1 year of war. Why did you decide to speak out now? Because this is dangerous for you.
Ну и как бы мы будем дальше молчать. А как потом жить в такой стране? Как жить потом в такой обстановке? Среди этих людей, я вот не знаю.
Sometimes there are no answers, just what tomorrow brings. Another day in the shadow of one man's war.
And Diana joins me now from Moscow, and we've seen events of commemoration across Europe, certainly across Ukraine. How has this day been marked in Moscow?
It's not being marked at all in any kind of official capacity. In fact, this is the second day of a 4-day holiday, and I think a lot of people are just trying to forget about the war. Yesterday was the Defender of the Fatherland Day, where President Putin gave a speech, and that was the patriotic moment that this time last year, the following morning, he chose to use to launch his special military operation, as he called it. But at that point, he thought that it would just be a matter of weeks, that it would all work very fast. All the way through this week, he has been giving speeches, his long-awaited State of the Nation address, where he's essentially clearly reconciled himself and had to reconcile the Russian people to the fact that this war is for the long haul. He said it was the responsibility of Russians essentially to gather together to weather this storm and to let them know that this is going to be economically extremely costly and, of course, as you saw in that report, in terms of loss of life, also extremely costly, even though the Russian people are not told the true cost of this war and they are not told the actual numbers. We have had some comments from the Russian Foreign Minister today, the Russian Foreign Ministry today in relation to this peace plan that the Chinese are putting forward. Russia, as it has done for a while, says that it welcomes the opportunity to solve the goals of the special military operation politically and diplomatically, but that it will not withdraw troops from those new territories that it claims as its own, and that any peace negotiations would have to take into account these new so-called territorial realities. Well, you can be pretty sure that Ukraine is not going to take them into account, or the rest of most of the rest of the world. And in fact, looking at that General Assembly resolution yesterday calling for a just peace in Ukraine, the Foreign Ministry also said, rather predictably, that, of course, the result where 7 countries only voted against the resolution was because the rest had been bullied and blackmailed by the US and the West and threatened with sanctions to cast their vote in the West's favour. It's pretty typical to hear this kind of commentary from the Foreign Ministry, but it does suggest that the likelihood of any kind of peace talks anytime soon is really extremely remote.
Diana, thank you very much indeed, and we're going to get more on that now because top diplomats have been gathering in New York today for the meeting of the UN Security Council, the talks centering around the anniversary of the war, with those testy exchanges between the Russian and Ukrainian members. During Council, the Ukrainian's foreign minister called for a minute's silence, but even during that solemn session came a rather disdainful interruption by the Russian representative. From New York, our correspondent Mark Stone looks now at that moment and examines the worldview of this war, a world far from united.
The Security Council is called to order.
In the Security Council chamber, Ukraine's foreign minister wanted to remember the cost of the past year, the cost of Russia's invasion.
I kindly ask everyone to observe a minute of silence in memory of the victims of the aggression.
But Russia's representative here interrupted the silence. He had another idea.
All of those who perished, all lives are priceless, and that is why we're rising to honor the memory of them all.
The Russian version of history is that Ukraine started all this. The minute silence resumed, he had successfully seized the moment. They were in this chamber a year ago exactly when Vladimir Putin in Moscow chose to announce his move on Ukraine. It represented a total rejection of this chamber, this institution, and the global order it tries to preserve. And this anniversary was a chance to count the cost.
Putin cannot, must not win in Ukraine. Because what's at stake on the battlefields is the international order itself. And that is at the heart of the United Nations.
If Russia stops fighting and leaves Ukraine, the war ends. If Ukraine stops fighting, Ukraine ends. The fact remains, one man, Vladimir Putin, started this war. One man can end it.
There is such symbolism to this place, the highest diplomatic body in the world. Moments in here have changed history, and yet right now, it does feel powerless.
Never mind the overwhelming rejection of Russia and its actions in Thursday's vote. Here, Russia has a seat and the power to block any initiatives that are proposed. The Chinese did present one, a 12-point plan, hardly a roadmap to peace, but an indication that they haven't moved even closer to Russia.
First of all, I would like to thank you and your nations.
As the Western Alliance foreign ministers spoke, their leaders gathered for a meeting of the G7. The outcome, bluntly, was more words, but nothing to unlock a negotiation. The message, the fighting cannot stop until Russia withdraws. Back in New York, the shuttle diplomacy, for what it's worth, continues. In truth, though, this day could only be about reflection of a year that changed the world, because there is no projection for what comes next.
We never give up. We are Ukrainians. Thank you.
And Mark joins me now from New York. So predictably a tetchy session, and one that, well, resolves not very much.
Yeah, once again, the United Nations proves to be such a powerful institution in terms of the words it's able to project, and in this case, the unity against Russia. But beyond that, the teeth are not at all sharp. Look, Mark, I think over the course of the past year, diplomats on all sides here in New York have wondered many times, gravely wondered where this conflict could go. The fact that talk of nuclear weapons, talk of World War III has not materialized is testament, I think, to the very, very careful diplomacy that we have seen here in New York and in capitals around the world. But it is also a reflection of bluff and bluster on behalf of Vladimir Putin. But nevertheless, the concern that such an unpredictable man with nuclear weapons in Russia could do something, it is always there. And I think that is why it's careful approach always here in Washington, in New York. The words have been very strong today. The actions, well, there's very little they can do.
OK, Mark, thank you very much indeed. This is a Sky News special from Kyiv coming up. One of Ukraine's staunchest allies since the start of the invasion. We'll see how the UK paid tribute to those killed in the conflict and get the latest from Germany, a country that could prove crucial for a Ukrainian victory. Let's get more now on the diplomatic push to support Ukraine. Let's speak to Michael Carpenter, the United States ambassador to the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Thank you very much for being with us. And I just wonder, first of all, a year on, whether you can actually believe that this is going on in Europe in the 21st century, and so much damage is being done to infrastructure and so much damage is being done to people's lives.
Yeah, Mark. Well, you know, we knew before this war began, we had the intelligence and the information that the Russians were planning this. Of course, they had deployed all that combat force on Ukraine's borders. So we knew it was coming, but that did not stop this from being so shocking in terms of not just the scale and scope of the war, but the atrocities that Russian forces are committing. I mean, we're talking about crimes against humanity. We're talking about filtration camps in the 21st century. And kids being deported against their will, torn from their families in Ukraine and sent to essentially be Russified and re-educated in Russia. It's something that, to be honest with you, I never thought I'd see in my lifetime, not on this scale.
And Michael, the other shocking thing is that there is no end in sight.
No, that's right. I mean, this continues to be a battle of attrition on the battlefield. However, I do think that Ukraine will prevail in this war. I can't tell you when, but it's clear that Ukrainians are defending their homes and their families and their neighborhoods. And so they've got the moral authority and they've got the willpower and the determination on their side. The Russian troops are demoralized. They're poorly led. They don't really know what they're fighting for. I mean, this claim that they're trying to denazify Ukraine is patently ridiculous. And so I think Ukraine has the advantage in terms of willpower, but it's going to be ultimately a matter of whether the West can provide them with the weapons and equipment that they need to sustain the advantage over the long term.
Yeah, well, that is the point. Do you think Western unity will be maintained as, you know, this second year progresses?
I do. You know, it's remarkable how many times pundits and others in the media have predicted that Western unity was on the verge of crumbling over the course of these last 365 days. And yet we've held together. You know, we've stood tall, we've stood with Ukraine, and we've continued to accelerate the types of equipment and the capabilities that we've been able to provide to Ukraine. I mean, don't forget at the beginning of this war, Javelin missiles were considered something that was a taboo that had been just broken and that was an exceptional piece of equipment to be providing to Ukraine. Now we're talking about main battle tanks and potentially other types of capabilities like fighter jets that no one thought we would be discussing a year ago.
And what about your organization, the OSCE? What can your organization do to reduce tensions here? Presumably, given, you know, what is happening, not much.
Well, look, I'll be honest with you, Mark. I don't see much scope for dialogue here at the OSCE. The Russians come to the table every week spewing their disinformation, lies, and propaganda. So there's no real genuine dialogue where we can exchange ideas about how to get to a peaceful resolution to this war. However, what we are doing at the OSCE, we've had a conceptual innovation here. Everything we've done for the last 30 years has been based on consensus. And just in the last 4 or 5 months, we've deployed a field operation to Ukraine that is the first OSCE field mission ever to be deployed abroad that is non-consensual in nature, that is essentially funded just by like-minded states, including the United States, which has made a generous contribution, and many of our allies as well. And that field mission will focus on Ukraine's wartime needs, things like demining, things like psychosocial support for war-affected populations, mitigating the tremendous environmental disaster that Russia's war is causing in Ukraine, and things of that nature. So, you know, we are making an impact, albeit maybe not as large as I'd like to see on the ground, but we need to continue to ramp up our efforts.
And finally, and briefly, I mean, what do you think the consequences of failure here are? Failure to, help Ukraine win this?
Well, look, the consequences are enormous. The ramifications could not be any bigger. We're not just talking about one country attacking another over disputed territory, and we're not even just talking about a violation of the fundamental rules of the international order like sovereignty and territorial integrity. We're talking about a country, a nuclear power, a permanent member of the UN Security Council invading its neighbor for no reason whatsoever and then perpetrating the most horrific and inhuman crimes on the ground as part of its campaign to intimidate the population in Ukraine and, frankly, to wipe the Ukrainian nation state off the map of Europe. If we allow this to stand, then I fear the type of world that our kids and grandkids will live in. It will not be the sort of place that we want. And so we really have to put an end to this naked aggression and all of its various ramifications, which are just horrific and no one should want us to have stand.
Okay, Ambassador, appreciate your time. Thank you for coming on the programme.
Thank you.
Now, from the moment of the invasion, the United Kingdom positioned itself as one of Ukraine's staunchest allies, whether providing homes for Ukrainian refugees, sending aid to those who stayed behind, or leading the push to supply Ukraine with ever more powerful weapons. Today, That solidarity was on full show as the anniversary of the war was marked. Inzamam Rashid has been looking at how the United Kingdom is paying tribute to those lost in the conflict.
At 11 o'clock, a minute's silence. Not for wars gone by, but for a war of our time. It was less remembrance, more solidarity for a country that's faced a year of brutal aggression. Prime Ministers past and present paid their respects as Ukrainians who now call Britain home prayed for an end to this conflict. In the city of Bradford, we met Olga, forced to leave her family and friends. She's now been living here for 8 months. For many like her, it's been a year of pain.
It was a year of loss. It was a year when you lost your home, your friends, your life. And all of us try to find another place to live, another friends, another people who can support us. So it's 1 year of our fight.
And giving up simply isn't an option for the Ukrainian community with a deep history in Bradford. Here, hope and strength over the last 12 months has been needed more than ever. These are Yana's most recent memories of Ukraine as she fled with her family, bombed buildings on their route out. There's no clearer reminder of war.
One half of your mind living in Ukraine every day.
She's been here now since August last year. She wants nothing less than to return home.
One day you just like this. You didn't prepare yourself to all this, and when you go in, you don't know where to go in. You don't know what's waiting you next day, and where you will be next day, and how you will survive this day.
Give them courage and resilience in battle.
To make that happen, Ukraine needs help, something Britain has been providing since day one of this war. Today, military recruits receive training in the southeast, even on this commemorative day. Perhaps a sign there may be more anniversaries to come. Inzamam Rashid, Sky News, Bradford.
Well, potentially crucial to any Ukrainian victory would be the fulsome support of Europe's biggest economy, Germany, where other NATO countries like the US, Poland and the UK have led on supplying weapons. Germany has proved much more reluctant, a country dealing with its own past. Germans lean towards a more pacifist foreign policy, but that opinion may be shifting. Let's speak to Europe correspondent Siobhan Robbins, who is in Berlin. So, Siobhan, what are the German people making of all this? What is their attitude to supporting Ukraine actively?
Well, if you have a look behind me, you can see the Brandenburg Gate lit up in the colours of Ukraine. I think that shows you what Germany thinks as a whole. There's a huge amount of support for Ukrainians. Hundreds of people here today took to the streets to show their support. A wrecked Russian tank was parked outside the Russian embassy here. People really back the Ukrainians. And we've seen the war triggering huge changes here in the last year. An historic turning point in military investment, for example, a breakaway from Russian energy, 1 million Ukrainian refugees welcomed. But as you say, there have also been some challenges for Germans. So we saw a lot of wrangling before finally the go-ahead was given for the Leopard 2 tanks to go, some of which have arrived today. And also the history of Germany continues to weigh heavy over public opinion, real concern here about escalation. So, for example, a recent poll about sending F-16 jets, only 25% of people support that. And I think the next 12 months will bring more challenges as Germany tries to continue to support Ukraine. Ukraine asks for more and more weapons, and Germany has to wrangle with its own red lines.
Siobhan, thank you very much indeed. Let's have a look at China's role in all this now. And Beijing has been calling for a comprehensive ceasefire, saying it wants to prevent the Russia-Ukraine crisis from getting out of control. Over the last year, Beijing has been providing Russia with support, but the US believes it may be preparing to ramp up that support and to sell it weapons. Our Asia correspondent, Helen Ann Smith, has this report.
Displays of prowess is something China is good at. The West once hoped this power could be the broker of peace. But it has spent the last year quietly providing Russia with finance, technology and diplomatic cover. The Americans now believe it's also preparing to sell arms.
China's position ultimately boils down to a pretty cynical calculation about what is best for China. It does care about its international reputation, but a relationship with a strong Russia also provides commodities, a peaceful northern border, and crucially, a like-minded ally in an increasingly tense standoff with the West.
And it's shifts in that standoff that may be pushing China closer to Putin.
That's my Air Force right there, buddy.
A row over a spy balloon, just the latest low ebb. In fact, China's top diplomat went to Moscow this week, solidifying what the two leaders once called a no-limits friendship. But there is caution too. Victor Gao has spent his career amongst the top echelons of China's leadership. And just listen to how he couches the terms of that friendship.
Without limits doesn't mean there should be no bottom line. There still should be a bottom line to a friendship which does not have an upper ceiling to it. And what should be the bottom line? That is UN Charter, respecting each other's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and whatever problems or disputes there are, you need to resolve them by peaceful means.
Reporting of the war is highly sanitized here. America and NATO framed as the aggressors. A useful narrative if China ever made its own move on Taiwan. What it does next will be watched intently. It could well alter the course of this war. Helen Ann Smith, Sky News in Beijing.
This is a Sky News special live from Kyiv this evening. Coming up, with Ukraine accusing Russia of potentially 70,000 war crimes, we return to Bucha and hear the story of one woman who watched as her mother was shot. Now, Ukrainian authorities say they are investigating almost 70,000 war crimes committed by Russian forces, but that justice won't be easy. We've been following the heartbreaking case of one 21-year-old woman who saw her mother shot dead as they walked home in Bucha. Earlier, I travelled back to that town where evidence of Russia's war crimes shocked the world.
It happens somewhere here.
In the forest on the outskirts of Bucha, Tetiana Sichkar is telling me how a war crime has devastated her life.
Suddenly I heard a very loud gunshot, so something, maybe it was blood or maybe it was a bullet.
She shows me a picture of her and her mum, the most important woman in her life. And she explains what happened the day they tried to walk home as Russian troops occupied their streets and the woodland tracks nearby, and that shot rang out.
I screamed, "Lay down," and we all fall on the ground. I tried to shake her leg. She didn't answer. Her head was all in blood. Okay. There was blood everywhere. Her eyes were still open and she was just staring. And I started to scream. I screamed for maybe 5 minutes.
Where do you think the shot came from?
My father believed it because the Russians were there. The sniper was on the second floor of that white building behind the trees.
Tetiana leads us to the grave of her mother.
Here it is. Of course, I miss most her because she was, of course, the closest one to me. But yeah.
But life's hard.
Yeah, but it's hard, but it goes on.
Do you think you will see the person who did this in a court of law on trial?
It's very likely that that person is already dead. But if that person is still alive, I believe that I will see him in the court and he'll take all the responsibilities, and maybe I'll ask him what made him do it to my family.
So now she is pursuing justice. Regular meetings with human rights lawyer Oksana Mikhailovich. They want Ukrainian police to stage a reconstruction next month to at least establish exactly where the shot came from, so they can perhaps identify the Russian military unit involved. They will then go after the commanders. I am sure there should be responsibility for each crime, says Oksana, and I will not stop because it is important. Tetiana says she owes it to her family to fight. She will not give up. One gravesite, one war crime, one destroyed life among so many here. And we will follow Tetiana's story. Deborah is back with me now for a final thought. We were here a year ago. We're here now. Do you think we'll be here in a year's time?
The fundamental problem is that nobody knows. There is no unified idea about what the solution to this war is. For Vladimir Putin, he's going to keep on fighting. He's showed no sign of wanting to back down. And for Ukraine, this is fundamental. They say that they rightly want to regain their territory as of the 1991 borders, which means all Russian forces out, not just from the Donbass, but also from Crimea. And so as long as you have those two totally polarized views on what the outcome might be, the war will continue.
I mean, fundamental for Ukraine. The question is, I guess, is it fundamental for the West, for other European countries, for the United States? Because they are going to provide the wherewithal for them to win this war.
If you take them at their word, which is all we can do, then it's absolutely fundamental to the entire foundation of the world order that has been built up since the end of the Second World War. That's what we're talking about here. It's about respecting the UN Charter, respecting the right of sovereignty, respecting sovereign borders. The Prime Minister of Ukraine, who I spoke to yesterday, said to me that if it can be allowed to stand, that in this day and age, a country's borders can be violated and there is no consequence, there is no pushback, then that means the lesson to other authoritarian regimes is that that can happen again. And that can only lead to one thing, and that is more war, potentially even the Third World War.
Yeah, and look, 15 seconds, you were with President Zelensky today. What was his mood? What was his tone?
Confident. Confident. He was live, giving his press conference. He believes, he hopes his country will win. And he needs it to win. Deborah, thank you very much indeed. And in the past year, the DEC's Ukraine appeal has raised more than £400 million in the UK. We'll leave you with the voices of Ukrainians in their homeland and singing They'll Never Walk Alone.
When you walk through a storm, hold your head up high. Don't be afraid of the dark.
At the end of the storm, there is a golden sky and the sweet silver song of a lark.
Walk on through the wind. Walk on through the rain.
For your dreams be tossed and blown.
Walk on. Walk on.
Yes, hope in your heart. And you'll never walk alone.